November 30th, 2025. Just minutes after sunrise, Buckingham Palace issued a statement that sent shockwaves around the entire world. Meghan Markle was no longer the Duchess of Sussex. But that cold, calculated announcement, it was just the tip of the iceberg. Because what happened behind those palace walls, the secrets, the betrayals, the heartbreak, is something you're absolutely not ready for. After years of silence, after countless attacks and public humiliations, King Charles has finally acted. And what he's revealed about Meghan Markle is absolutely devastating. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the king had no choice but to do the unthinkable. And trust me, this is not the story you've been told. The announcement that shocked the world. Let me paint you the picture of that morning. November 30th, 2025. The world wakes up to what seems like an ordinary day, but inside Buckingham Palace, history is about to be made. Sir Clive Aldwell, the newly appointed Lord Chamberlain, steps up to the press podium. There's no ceremony, no elaborate presentation, no royal family members in sight. Just one man, one microphone, and 19 words that would change everything. Meghan Markle's title as Duchess of Sussex has been revoked, effective immediately, by order of His Majesty the King. 19 words. That's it. No explanation, no apology, no emotion, just cold, hard fact. Can you imagine the moment you heard this? Where were you? What went through your mind? Drop a comment below and tell me your first reaction, because I guarantee millions of people around the world had the exact same stunned response. But here's what makes this announcement so absolutely chilling. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a reaction to one incident. This was the conclusion of a decision that had been forged in silence for months. Think about that. While Meghan and Harry were doing interviews, launching projects, building their brand in California, King Charles was quietly, methodically, deliberately preparing for this exact moment. The lack of spectacle? That was intentional. Where were the flags? Where was the balcony appearance? Where was the traditional royal pageantry that accompanies every major announcement? Gone, deliberately removed, because King Charles didn't want celebration. He wanted resolution. And that strategic silence? That's the monarchy's way of speaking volumes without raising its voice. This wasn't about revenge. This was about reclaiming control. For years, the royal family had weathered the storm. The departure, the interviews, the Netflix series, the constant attacks. They'd maintained their dignity, their silence, their commitment to never complain, never explain. But now the House of Windsor wasn't just responding. It was drawing a line in the sand. And on one side of that line stood centuries of tradition, duty, and service. On the other, a former actress who turned royalty into a commodity. So, the question is, what finally pushed King Charles over the edge? What made him break years of silence in the most public and devastating way possible? The signature that changed everything. Now, before we go deeper, let me tell you about the detail that makes this whole situation even more profound. According to palace sources, the decree revoking Meghan's title wasn't signed by a courtier. It wasn't delegated to a ceremonial board. It wasn't handled by advisors or legal teams. King Charles signed it himself, personally. Do you understand what that means? This is a man who has hundreds of documents cross his desk every single day. He has people whose entire job is to handle official business. But for this one devastating decision, he insisted on signing it with his own hand. The symbolism is absolutely undeniable. This wasn't simply about protocol or procedure. This was deeply, painfully personal. Buckingham Palace's communications team was careful with their language. They emphasized that this was not an act of punishment. It was, they said, a safeguard, a necessity, a measure taken to uphold the dignity of the institution. But let's be real here. When a king personally signs an order stripping his daughter-in-law of her royal title, when he breaks decades of tradition to make such a public statement, when he allows no room for ambiguity, that's not just institutional protection. That's a father who's been pushed to his absolute breaking point. But here's what nobody's talking about. This decision didn't come out of nowhere. It came after a months-long investigation that uncovered a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. According to insider sources, senior advisors conducted what they're calling a detailed internal audit. They examined Meghan's public commentary, her commercial ventures, her use of royal associations. And what they found wasn't just problematic. It was, in their words, actively undermining the institution. This wasn't scandal. This was something far more dangerous: erosion. Quiet, persistent, calculated erosion of everything the monarchy represents. And once King Charles saw the full picture, once he understood the complete scope of what was happening, there was no going back. The secret operation, Order 17A. Now, let me tell you about something that sounds like it's straight out of a spy thriller. Because while the world was watching Meghan's Netflix series and reading about her latest projects, something else was happening behind palace walls. Something with a code name, Order 17A. I'm not making this up. Deep inside St. James's Palace, in a locked room that most palace staff will never see, a covert legal operation was quietly unfolding. And at the center of it all was a document unlike any crafted in royal history. Order 17A wasn't born from vengeance. It wasn't hastily drafted in anger. It was a calculated maneuver rooted in constitutional foresight and a desperate need to preserve the monarchy's authority in the modern age. For over a year, senior aides had been compiling evidence. Every time Meghan used the Sussex title in entertainment contracts, every merchandise filing, every digital platform, every interview where she leveraged her royal connection, they documented it all. And the picture they assembled? According to sources, it was absolutely damning. Royalty wasn't being honored. It was being commodified. Enter Lady Margaret Ashcombe, a formidable legal mind known as the Archivist of the Crown. She was summoned to architect the framework that would become Order 17A. Her approach? Cold, clinical, devoid of any sentiment. She didn't see personalities. She saw precedents. Working alongside Princess Anne, who had been warning about this for years, they formed a clandestine committee that would redefine the boundaries of royal legitimacy. Can you imagine the meetings, the late-night strategy sessions, the weight of knowing they were creating something that could fundamentally change how the monarchy operates? Order 17A included revolutionary provisions, new protocols for reviewing titles every 5 years, restrictions on commercial use of royal associations, and a digital sovereignty clause that barred former royals from using royal-derived terms in monetized spaces without formal approval. Think about what that means. This wasn't just about Meghan. This was about creating an ironclad firewall to protect the crown from anyone who might try to weaponize a royal title for personal gain. The final draft was completed in September 2025, just 2 months before the public announcement. But here's a detail that shows you how serious this was. Catherine, Princess of Wales, influenced the final language. Though not a formal signatory, Catherine reportedly urged the architects to keep the tone firm but not vindictive, dignified rather than defensive. Her edits softened no consequences but removed every trace of personal blame. It was to be surgical justice, not emotional revenge. And then came the trigger that accelerated everything: a confidential pitch for a new docuseries titled Behind the Crown, which allegedly included scripted reenactments of royal life featuring dramatized versions of living family members. That proposal never reached the palace through formal channels. It reached them through investigative leaks. And it was the final straw. The Queen's prophecy. But here's what makes this story even more heartbreaking. Queen Elizabeth saw this coming. Long before Charles wielded his pen, long before Order 17A was even conceived, the late Queen Elizabeth had already sensed the storm on the horizon. In one of her final handwritten notes to her son, she wrote something that now feels chillingly prophetic. Be careful of legacy being traded for spectacle. Let that sink in for a moment. The Queen, who had navigated decades of royal upheaval, who had witnessed abdications and divorces and scandals, sensed that this situation was different. Sources close to the late Queen say she had no illusions about the world Harry had stepped into with Meghan by his side. She'd seen royal marriages under pressure before. But this felt fundamentally different. Meghan wasn't just resisting tradition. She was reframing it, rewriting it, and marketing the rewrite to the world. In the months following Meghan and Harry's initial departure in 2020, Queen Elizabeth began corresponding more frequently with Charles through handwritten notes delivered by trusted aides. These weren't orders, they were reflections, warnings wrapped in maternal guidance. One note, preserved by a senior courtier, read, "What one turns into content, one no longer honors. Do not confuse silence with surrender." Another, penned shortly after the Oprah interview, was even more blunt. "They will call it bravery, but we know bravery when we see it." Can you imagine being King Charles, reading those words from his mother, understanding that she saw exactly what was happening, but knowing that royal protocol prevented her from acting? But it was after the Netflix special aired that the Queen took what many believe was her most decisive step. In early 2022, just months before her death, she drafted a final memorandum addressed solely to Charles. The contents were never released to the public, but those who saw it described it as deeply personal yet strategically pointed. It reportedly gave Charles her full blessing to take whatever action was necessary to preserve the crown's future, even if that action meant cutting ties that once felt unthinkable. According to one of her longtime ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth watched parts of the Netflix footage alone. Afterward, she murmured something that would haunt Charles for years. "Mocking the fabric of tradition isn't brave. It's ignorant." That moment stayed with Charles. It wasn't anger he saw in his mother. It was grief. And that grief began shaping his own. Queen Elizabeth never ordered action. She believed the weight of monarchy required patience, not panic. Her guidance to Charles was simple but clear. Act when it's time, not when it's loud. And when she passed later that year, those words lingered. They became Charles's compass. His proof that he wasn't merely reacting, he was fulfilling a legacy. The Netflix declaration of war. Now let's talk about what really pushed this situation past the point of no return. The Netflix series. When that documentary aired, the palace initially tried to maintain their dignified silence, but behind closed doors. According to insiders, it was described as nothing less than emotional warfare in 4K. From the moment the series opened, it was clear this wasn't a documentary seeking understanding. It was a dismantling. The monarchy wasn't just questioned. It was framed, dissected, and criticized on an unprecedented global stage. And then came the moment. The one that, according to sources, hit Queen Elizabeth harder than any political scandal ever had. Meghan theatrically demonstrating the curtsy she gave the Queen and then bursting into laughter. Think about that. A sacred gesture, one that represents centuries of tradition and respect, turned into a punchline for millions of viewers worldwide. But here's what disturbed King Charles most. This wasn't grief on screen. This wasn't spontaneous emotional expression. It was strategy. A 6-part spectacle with carefully timed story arcs, emotionally potent editing, and cliffhanger accusations designed to spark outrage, not understanding. The royal family had weathered documentaries before, but never one like this, never one produced by their own blood. What made it even worse? The series allegedly used royal emblems and private family footage without direct approval. The Sussex crest appeared throughout. Royal interiors, private engagements, references to confidential protocols, all repurposed for dramatic effect. Every frame felt like it had been extracted from the palace, not granted. And while lawyers debated whether these uses violated agreements, King Charles saw something more damning: a violation of trust. Public opinion exploded. In the UK, the reaction was mixed. Some sympathized. Others called it theatrical treason. In the United States, the reception was warmer, but even there, questions swirled about intent, timing, and financial motives. But within Buckingham Palace, the feeling was simpler and far more personal. They called it betrayal, dressed in pixels. According to those closest to him, Charles was shaken to his core. He described the special in private as emotional warfare, because that's exactly what it felt like. These weren't just painful revelations. They were calculated attacks that came after months of ignored letters, rejected visits, and diplomatic efforts to reconnect. The door didn't close with a bang. It creaked shut slowly, painfully, deliberately. The father who tried everything. Now, here's the part that's going to break your heart. Because contrary to what you might think, King Charles didn't jump straight to revoking Meghan's title. He tried. God, did he try. In the wake of the Netflix eruption, Charles didn't retreat to fury. He reached for reconciliation. He still believed, perhaps naively, that a bond of blood and memory could be salvaged. A personal letter was dispatched to Harry. No official headers, no royal seal. Just a father writing to his son. Weeks passed. No reply. He tried again. This time, a phone call. Straight to voicemail. Charles didn't stop there. He asked aides to deliver an invitation. A quiet weekend at Sandringham. No press, no protocols, no obligations, just family. But even that was met with silence. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being a father, reaching out again and again to your own son and receiving nothing but silence in return? When a response finally arrived, it came not from Harry's voice, but from a solicitor's desk in California. The tone was detached, clinical, filled with legal jargon. It addressed matters of intellectual property and reputational harm. But what it didn't contain, not once, was Harry's name. No personal apology, no attempt at reunion, no acknowledgement of the man who had once held him through every storm of childhood. And in that absence, Charles felt something deeper than anger. He felt the final flicker of hope die. Within the palace, that silence wasn't interpreted as peace. It was interpreted as posture. Meghan's strategic distance, her layers of legal intermediaries, her refusal to engage directly, it all told a story far louder than words. She wasn't merely absent. She was fortified. Palace insiders say Charles was emotionally wrecked. His grief wasn't theatrical. It was exhausted. Even Princess Anne, known for her unflinching discipline, reportedly told her brother, "If you don't act now, it will be too late." Prince Edward echoed the sentiment, warning that what was once a crisis of image had become a crisis of precedent. The longer the monarchy allowed itself to be manipulated from abroad, the more it surrendered its authority, its dignity, and its future. And then came the final straw, a formal notice from Meghan's attorneys outlining alleged financial damages due to anticipated changes in title usage. Listen to that again. Meghan's team sent the King of England an invoice for potential loss of brand equity. It wasn't the content of the letter that struck Charles. It was what it symbolized. There was no mention of Harry, no appeal for understanding, only the cold arithmetic of brand equity. The monarchy had extended its hand. What it received in return was a bill. And that's when Charles realized he wasn't dealing with a daughter-in-law. He was dealing with a brand. The commodification of royalty. Let's talk about what was really happening while the palace tried to reconcile. Because while Meghan and Harry spoke publicly about privacy and healing, behind the scenes in Los Angeles, something very different was taking shape. A machine was being built. Trademark filings for Sussex Global Holdings LLC appeared as early as January 2021. The intentions listed: ventures across publishing, media, fashion, digital platforms, and wellness. This wasn't a quiet retreat from public life. This was a branded migration. For royal aides tracking the fallout, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Meghan's public grievances weren't spontaneous emotional releases. They were synchronized. Think about the timeline: explosive Oprah interview, children's book launch, miscarriage essay, Spotify teaser announcement, Netflix docuseries, international speaking tour, one after the other. Personal revelations were immediately followed by product launches or press appearances. It created the impression that pain had become currency. And the monarchy? It was the marketing engine. At the heart of this pattern was the Sussex brand, a name steeped in royal origin, now repurposed for corporate endeavors. The palace's internal legal team documented everything: use of the royal crest without permission, stylized Duchess references in foreign contracts, events that heavily implied royal endorsements. What alarmed officials wasn't just the frequency, it was the consistency. This wasn't confusion or misunderstanding. This was execution. According to sources, one palace advisor put it bluntly during an internal meeting: "The crown has survived divorce, abdication, and scandal, but it has never faced commodification." Think about what that means. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, the British monarchy was facing an existential threat it had no protocol for: royalty being packaged, distributed, and sold in digital episodes. Behind palace gates, the mood turned grim. Meghan's enterprise was no longer seen as a private reinvention. It was viewed as a rebranding of the institution without consent. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all was Harry's transformation. Once the lively, unguarded prince who offered levity to royal occasions, he now appeared insulated, subdued, detached. Communication with his family grew sporadic, then ceased entirely. Letters from Charles went unanswered. Invitations from William were quietly declined. Catherine's attempt to meet him privately during a U.S. visit was met with silence. Within palace circles, a phrase began to surface: lost to the narrative. Harry, they feared, had become not just emotionally distant, but fully entwined in the brand his wife had built. It was a shift not just in proximity, but in loyalty. The monarchy's greatest fear was unfolding before them. Not that Meghan had left the palace, but that she was building one of her own, one with global reach, media dominance, and the Sussex title emblazoned across its gates. The final letter? And now we come to perhaps the most devastating moment of all. In the early hours of December 1st, 2025, just one day after the public announcement, a royal courier delivered a letter to California. It was handwritten, sealed with the monarch's crest, and it contained words that King Charles refused to let any advisor or aide touch. This was a father's final goodbye. The letter had been drafted in solitude, long after the signatures on Order 17A had dried. Charles insisted on writing it himself, not as the king, not as the head of state, but as a father who had exhausted every path to peace. And what did it say? According to sources who've seen it, the letter was tender but firm, a confession of heartbreak, a plea for clarity, a line drawn not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Charles told Harry that while he still loved him, the actions taken were not against a person. They were against a distortion. Unlike the press statement, polished with palace protocol, this letter bore none of the palace's restraint. It was raw, unfiltered. Charles admitted that he had waited too long to act, hoping Meghan would one day return not to the family, but to its values. He wrote of the pain caused by the mockery, the strategic silences, the legal barricades. And still, he left a final sentence that carried the weight of both regret and hope. The door remains open to the son I knew, if he ever returns without the mask. Let that sink in. If he ever returns without the mask? What mask? The brand, the performance, the carefully curated image that's replaced the real Harry, the one Charles raised, the one who laughed and served and connected with people authentically. That's what a father's heartbreak looks like. Not anger, not vengeance, just the quiet grief of watching your child become someone you don't recognize. Hours later, the monarchy sealed the moment with a gesture few would ever witness. At Windsor Castle, in a quiet room inside the royal archives, 4 officials gathered with no press and no ceremony. A parchment card marked Duchess of Sussex was placed into the legacy vault and stamped "Ceased by royal directive." That vault hadn't been opened for title removal since 1936, and now it held one more chapter: Meghan's response. Back in Montecito, Meghan's team moved swiftly with a prepared statement, carefully worded and cold in tone. It emphasized her continued commitment to equity, compassion, and family values. Beautiful words, corporate words, meaningless words, because nowhere in that response was Charles mentioned, nowhere was Harry's father acknowledged, Nowhere was there even a hint of recognition that this might be painful for anyone other than herself. To palace insiders, it was confirmation. This was no longer about family. It was about branding, legacy, and leverage. And behind the gloss of those perfectly crafted words, the damage was already done. But here's what's fascinating. While Meghan's statement dominated headlines, something else was happening inside the palace walls, the quiet royal's rise. Because while the world fixated on what had been lost, the palace focused on who was stepping up. Enter Lady Louise Windsor. While Meghan turned her back on the crown, Lady Louise, daughter of Prince Edward, granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth, quietly stepped forward. And she didn't step forward with headlines or controversy. She stepped forward with quiet resolve. Throughout late 2025, she was seen accompanying Princess Anne on engagements across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, absorbing royal duties not with entitlement, but with reverence. To the public, it felt like the return of something lost: humility. Princess Anne had reportedly handpicked Louise as part of a long-term strategy. She knew that if the monarchy were to survive in the digital age, it needed to offer more than tradition. It needed continuity, authenticity, and loyalty beyond the lure of influence. Discussions began in the Royal Advisory Council about restoring a title once promised but never fully granted, the Duchess of Edinburgh. Bestowing it upon Louise would send a clear signal. The future of the monarchy would not be shaped by celebrity, but by duty. And public reaction? It was swift and surprising. Polling indicated a surge in approval for Lady Louise, with many calling her the royal they wish they knew earlier. Where Meghan offered spectacle, Louise offered silence. Where one branded the crown, the other preserved it. And in that contrast, the monarchy began reclaiming its narrative. Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained silent after the announcement, but she was seen wearing the Prince of Wales brooch during a children's charity event the very next day, a quiet symbol of resilience. William, when asked privately, responded with words that cut deep. "This isn't about who we love, it's about what we protect." And Princess Anne? She returned to duty the very next morning. No comment, no pause, just presence. So, here we are. The truth is finally out. King Charles didn't act out of anger. He didn't act out of vengeance. He acted out of necessity. After years of trying, after months of investigation, after exhausting every possible path to reconciliation. What he revealed wasn't just about one woman or one title. It was about drawing a line between serving the institution and exploiting it. The monarchy survived this crisis not through dramatic pronouncements, but through something far more powerful: consistency, presence, duty. And while Meghan may have lost her title, the real question is, what did she really lose? And what did she never actually have? Because titles can be revoked, but integrity, character, genuine commitment to something greater than yourself, those are things you either have or you don't, and no royal decree can grant them or take them away. In the days following the announcement, a new body was formed within the palace, the Windsor Integrity Office, tasked with monitoring title usage, brand affiliations, and public narratives. It marks a new chapter for the monarchy, one where tradition will not just be honored, but actively defended. As King Charles looked out over the frost-covered gardens of Highgrove, witnesses say he didn't speak of victory or vindication. He whispered something simpler, something more profound. a vow to restore what was lost and defend what still remains. The monarchy had spoken, and this time it would not be silenced again. So I want to ask you, do you think King Charles did the right thing? Was this justice, or was it too harsh? And more importantly, do you believe Meghan ever actually wanted to be part of the royal family? Or was this always about building a brand? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if this opened your eyes to what really happened behind palace walls, hit that like button and subscribe, because there's so much more to this story that the mainstream media won't tell you. The truth is finally out, and it's more devastating than anyone imagined. Thanks for watching.